So the 2023 World Computer Chess Championship is underway. And it doesn't have a lot of participants, but the participants are quite interesting all the same. Today I have a really fascinating game that was played in the fourth round. And even though it was a draw, and a lot of the games have been draws, it has to be said that it is absolutely stellar. I mean, we're talking crazy, complicated, and exciting. And so, yes, even though it did end with a split point, it was absolutely amazing. You really have to see this. So who are the players? So we have Fritz, which is the flagship program of Chessbase. And even though it bears the same name as the original one that started in, I think it's like the 80s, obviously the author of the engine behind the Fritz brand name has changed several times over the years, especially since Franz Morsch retired. The current one is based on an engine called Ginkgo, and which actually won the software championship last year. And it's programmed by Frank Schneider. My apologies. Now, it has to be said that the hardware in the World Computer Chess Championship is fascinating because everybody brings whatever they want. So if you have a supercomputer running from the National Defense, you're allowed to use it. No restrictions. Unlike a lot of competitions nowadays, which run on pretty much uniform hardware. Great hardware, but uniform. And certainly not on this scale. So Fritz is running on 192 cores, overclocked at 3.5 gigahertz, which is crazy. And it has no less than 1.5 terabytes of RAM. I mean, I thought my laptop with 32 gigabytes was pretty beastly, but 1.5 terabytes, oh wow. Okay, that's on the white side. On the black side, we have Stoofvlees, and I hope I'm getting the name right. And it's programmed by, I think he's Italian, an Italian programmer who lives in Belgium now, by the name of Giancarlo Bascuto. And if I butchered his name, my apologies, my friend. So he is a brilliant programmer who has a deep history with neural networks in general, as well as engines. He had a deep engine called Deepmind. And right now he has adopted a structure very much like AlphaZero, a convolutional neural network, and he's named it Stoofvlees. So let's get right to the game. Okay, so here we have, it starts with a pretty classic Italian. I'll just go forward in the moves. Okay. And until now, it's pretty much theory. So I'm just going to skip it. Not a big deal. This is not where the excitement starts anyway. Theory says here that you can play bishop f1. You have bishop e3 that was played by Nihal and versus Sevian in the Sharjah Masters in May this very year. And okay, so they played bishop f1. These are the moves of the actual game. C takes d4, c6, knight b1. Now it has to be said that's kind of an interesting move. So the knight on a3 obviously isn't doing a lot, you know. Really not a lot to say that it's not a very good square for it. And yeah, so Fritz decides that it has to be brought back to the game, and it could of course try to play on knight c4, but opted not to. And if it had played knight c4, just in case you're curious, the game probably would have been, let's say, knight takes c4, rook takes c4, d5, pretty equal. So knight b1, d5, e5. And here's the first really curious move, I have to say, by Stoofvlees. And I'm not arguing that it's bad, because who am I to argue with an engine that's probably 1,000 elo at least above me? But still, it still looks kind of bizarre. The classic move here would be knight e4. And yeah, I mean, that would be pretty standard play. There's really not a lot to say about it. But instead it plays knight h5, which is far from obvious. And the reason it's not obvious, honestly, is because you could just play g3, which is actually what was played, and suddenly the f4 is excluded, and where the heck does the knight go? Granted, the knight isn't necessarily in immediate danger, but what the heck is it doing on h5 now then? So Stoofvlees is not impressed, wasn't worried about this, and grabs the bull by the horns with f6, attacking the e5 pawn here, and obviously threatening to bring in the artillery on the F file. Impressive. Okay. So bishop e3, F takes e5, D takes e5, D4. Damn. Nice move. So this is really strong and very incisive. And the point is that here, if white had played, let's say, knight takes d4, then with the idea, of course, I should point out, of attacking the knight here with the queen. Okay. Then queen takes h5, bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, knight f3 check, picks up the bishop or the knight or the rook, whichever you might prefer. So instead he played, after d4, he played bishop g5. And black continued with queen c7, knight bd2, bishop e6, knight h2. Okay, this is where it goes really wild. Look at the position. Take a few seconds. You know, what's going on here? So we have obviously the bishop here on a7, and it's obviously threatening the king via x-ray. And by x-ray I mean there's a pawn in front, but once the pawn moves, that bishop will be aiming straight at the king. Okay, we have the rook obviously also attacking on the f file. And eventually, if the pawn were to move, then we'd also have tricks like knight takes g3. In fact, you might even have that now. Let's say knight takes g3 with discovered checks, whatever. Doesn't look very convincing, but why not? But no. Stoofvlees actually plays the quite amazing rook takes f2. I mean, wow. It's not obvious. Okay, so a few comments here. It has to be pointed out that Fritz, because I got to see the logs, the 192 core version of Fritz, that is, had actually predicted the sequence completely, as had Stoofvlees. They both had predicted this. They had slightly different evaluations. Here, even with best play, and you'll see that best play is nothing that's really very obvious. It's worth looking at the lines. With best play, Fritz had predicted itself to having plus 0.83. So not quite a pawn, but doing a little bit better. And Stoofvlees, cool as a cucumber, thought that white was better, but just barely with 0.22 pawns above. That's, of course, assuming they followed the main lines that they both predicted with best play. Okay. So white did not take the rook. Instead he plays bishop d3. But obviously the question begs, why not? Why can't you take the rook? Now, the engines, at least in their lines, they don't actually tell us why, because they just assume that everybody knows why and they're playing the best moves. Wow. Well, when you're 3,500, I guess that's the way life is, eh? Just really easy looking from far above. Okay, so what happens if you take the rook? So if you take the rook, and of course this is the most obvious question, things go bad really, really, really fast. You're up a rook, but you're going to soon be down a lot of other things. So check, d4, d3 check, and of course now we have that, remember that bishop with the x-ray? It's attacking the king. Oops. So you have two possible moves, and we'll look at them both because they're worth analyzing. So the first one, obviously, is bishop e3. You know, put the bishop in front. And if you do that, then you have queen takes e5. Okay. And the threat on g3 is absolutely catastrophic. As you can see, the knight and the queen are both attacking that g3 pawn, and there's no way to protect it. The bishop can't go anywhere because, remember, it's being pinned by the bishop on a7, and there's no one to come to its defense. So Oh, what about the queen? Well, if the queen comes on f3, then we're going to have, let's say, queen f3, rook f8, and oops, you've lost the queen. So that's not going to work. So what do we do? Well, you've got knight e4. It's the only shot that really seems to make any kind of sense. Knight e4, that obviously you're giving up the knight, but you're up a rook. Knight takes g3. Doesn't matter. We still take it. Rook f8, check. Knight f3. I mean, you're not going to give the queen, right? Bishop b8. Beautiful move. And the battery of bishop and queen on g3 is just disastrous. Even if the knight were to move away, everything's going to start falling apart because you can still play on queen h2, etc. And it's just absolute disaster. So, yeah. So instead, we have the other option. I mean, bishop e3 loses. Okay. We have king g2. It's the only other move. Bishop d5 check. Knight hf3. Knight takes e5. And you can see already we have this big problem of the pin and the battery on the king here. And of course, the bishop here on a7 is attacking these squares here. So the king can never retreat to them. It's getting really hairy here. And we have all kinds of little tricks here on g3 hanging with the queen there. So, yeah. So, bishop f4. Knight takes. G takes. Knight takes f3. Knight takes f3. Queen takes f4. And, yeah. Even though on the board, white is up material, everything is going to start coming apart here. So, an example would be bishop takes d3. Getting rid of the pawn and trying to free up some stuff. Rook f8, attacking that pin. And now, for example, if white were to try to protect that knight with rook f1, seems reasonable on surface. Queen g5 check. Don't forget the knight is pinned by the bishop on d5. So knight cannot touch the king. The squares here are being attacked by the bishop. So as a result, again, the king cannot escape on f2 or anything like that. So king h1, queen g3, game over. Okay, so this is what happens if you actually decide to take the rook. And it's the explanation as to why can't I take the rook? Well, it has to be pointed out that both engines had predicted this, and they weren't even the least bit worried, and none of them had predicted trying to take it. So you have to kind of figure out what's going on your own with the help of the engine. So bishop d3, and it was played after only 26 seconds, suggesting that Fritz had predicted this and was pretty comfortable with it. Knight takes e5. Okay. Bishop takes h7 check. And now we're going to understand what the whole point of bishop d3 was. King takes, queen check, king g8. Okay, kind of forced. And now we finally take that knight, that rook, sorry. But it doesn't matter. Black is not winning, but nor is black losing. It's dynamically balanced according to the evaluations of both the engines, according to their logs. Like I said, neither of them thought that there was this big advantage. White was a little bit more optimistic, but not so much as to think he was winning, just had the initiative. Okay. Bishop f7. Now, the bishop f7 is a fascinating move simply because, not because I can tell you why all of the other moves are not good. I mean, you could spend a lot of time trying to analyze it, but it's not worth it. But I will say this much. It's the only move that doesn't lose. So yes, even though black did all of this deliberately and decided to throw fire on the board, a la Shiro Vortal, it has to be pointed out that he's also walking a tightrope here. So yeah, any move that's not bishop f7 would lose outright for black. only move. But both engines had predicted this, and quite some time ago. Queen h4. Now, as extraordinary as the entire sequence was, both of these supercomputers, albeit vastly different types of engines, one being a massive AlphaZero type neural network running on 4 massive GPUs, 4090s, and the other one's using as a more classic deep analyst, very fast engine with 192 overclock processors. In spite of all of that, in spite of being coming from very different corners of the programming world and design, they actually agreed on almost all the moves. I mean, you can see what they were predicting, and you can see if one of them deviated from the other. And I don't mean like one played a losing move, but there are times when you have 2 or 3 plausible moves that are equally drawish or whatever. Both of them had pretty much predicted every single move. They agreed on all the choices, except for here. And it's not because there's a losing move here. The difference is negligible as far as I can tell from the computer analysis. It's the only time they actually kind of said, yeah, I would have played that a little bit differently. Here, Stoofvlees had predicted queen d1 instead of queen h4. Might as well look at it. And it wouldn't have changed the outcome. So had it been played, then you would have knight d3 check. And after that, the likely line would have been king g2, knight takes e1 check, queen takes e1, queen b6. Who am I to argue? Knight hf3, rook e8, queen f1, queen takes b2. Okay. Rook e1, queen takes e2. And believe it or not, according to them, this would be an ultra-dynamic equality. But if you look at the material, it's just a mess. It takes an engine to tell you to reach that conclusion with a straight face. Because, yeah, I mean, we're talking a massive amount of pawns for peace and whatever. It's a mess. The engines say, yeah, it's nothing to worry about. It's pretty equal. Fantastic. Okay, back to the game. Queen h4. Bishop d5. And again, this is black's only non-losing move. But doesn't lose. It just maintains the balance. Still, impressive sequence. Rook e4. And yeah, I did research why the move is the only one that doesn't lose and analyze the other moves, but it's a lot of analysis and doesn't really pay off. I mean, it's interesting, but yeah. Feel free to research it. So, rook e4, d3 check. This was the actual game. Bishop e3, okay. Bishop takes e3, rook takes, fine. Queen b6. And here again, we're going to have a few more interesting complications. So after queen b6, black is going to win another pawn on b2, and there's no way to protect it. Because if you were to try something ridiculous like, I don't know, b3, then yeah, rook f8 check is going to win instantly. Because don't forget the rook on e3 is actually being pinned. So when you put a knight here, there's no rook helping to protect it. There's just this other knight and everything's going to fall apart. So, yeah. So, queen g5. Queen takes b2. And rook takes e5. Now, I will show you what happens after queen takes e5, which was the first move that I looked at. And then I realized, yeah, there's a problem there. This is the first time that Fritz's optimism starts to really wane. Until now, it had been like plus 0.60, 0.70, whatever. It hadn't gone into bonkers land thinking that it was winning or anything, but it was still convinced that it had a nice edge, lots of a promising position. Now it didn't think it that much. It actually dropped its evaluation to a very modest plus 0.23, kind of matching Stoofvlees by now. It could be just a style thing. I wouldn't make too much of it. You know, it doesn't mean like, oh, Fritz is worse because it evaluated it differently. They found the same moves after all. They agreed on them and they played them both, and yeah. So so after queen takes b2, obviously we're attacking both the rook on a1 and the knight on d2. Now if you play, let's say, queen takes c5, it's a loser really fast. You protect the rook on a1 thanks to your queen on e5. But after queen takes d2, king f1, queen takes h2, catastrophe. The king is kind of stuck after rook f8. You're going to get mated. So yeah. So after rook takes e5, and by doing rook takes e5, now we have the queen protecting d2, but you lost the rook on a1. You don't take it immediately. At least that's not what they did. Instead, black played queen d4 check. That's Swish and Sook. And it has to be pointed out that taking immediately on a1 would lose for black. Really? Well, it would be much worse in any case. Why? So if you take immediately on a1 with queen takes a1, it's the move that sort of says, why don't you play this? You have the rather extraordinary rook takes d5. Wow. Pawn takes. Okay, what are you going to do? Queen takes check. King h8. Knight hf3. And the evaluation here is about plus 1.5. So a really nice advantage. And it boils down to this. The king here is kind of isolated. You're going to have two knights versus the rook attacking it. And you even have a potential h4, h5 to muddy the waters. Is it winning? Absolutely. I didn't analyze deeply enough to know this, but I did look at the lines and it looked really, really unpleasant for black. It's not clear that black will be able to survive this. So, queen d4 check. They both agreed on this anyway. There wasn't a possibility of making a mistake here. They both saw it. Queen d4 check, queen e3, rook f8 check, knight f3, queen takes a1. Now we take it. Rook e8, queen takes a2. Wild. Rook takes f8, king takes f8, queen f4 check, king g8, queen b8 check, king h7, queen d6, bishop takes f3. Look at this. Last touch. Queen takes d3 check. We don't take on f3 immediately. Bishop here. Doesn't make much of a difference, does it? Queen takes e4, king g8, queen a8, king h7, queen h5. Now, obviously there's a repetition here and it could be draw right now. White actually chose to prolong the game by deviating slightly. It didn't change anything. They played another 25 moves, simplified it, swapped the queens, knight versus the pawn, and it ended in a draw. I'll show you the final position. They got to this. Queen e6, knight g3, da-da-da, and they said a draw. And it needs to be pointed out that this is a table-based draw, so it's not up for debate. Impressive.